I know I've made some very poor decisions recently, but I can give you my complete assurance that my work will be back to normal. I still got the greatest enthusiasm and confidence in the mission. Anybody know who said that? Huh? How? Or were you too high to remember? He later in the dialogue said, honestly, I think you ought to sit down calmly, take a stress pill, and think things over. That's sort of what we're doing. Kubrick, as most of you know, was a genius, a filmmaker of remarkable breadth and change, but also a truly great photographer, to which many people don't realize that he was a documentarian journalist before he started making films. And so that idea of a person like that represents everything that the Lens and Screen Arts in this program aspires to. Lastly, I want to put up, I just hit it, right? Somebody? Did it do it? No. That's my first encounter of the first kind. I didn't make that picture. Adam Bell made that picture using Photoshop's generator, an AI-based program. It's an abstraction, it's a space, it's a photogram. It's something I have never really quite seen, an image like that. He made that, last November, I think? He made about 20 of them in about 5 minutes. Printed this one. And so it sort of represents that slab for me from 2001. It's a remarkable image that, we think, okay, we know those kind of images. It's vague, it's enigmatic, it's confusing, it's, in a way, unreplicable. And so that's what really said, okay, let's buy into this. let's accept what's going on. Lastly, I want to just go through a bunch of terms. The terms we all are hearing, but most of us don't know anything about. Some we do, some we don't. Algorithm, artificial intelligence, artificial neural network, backpropagation, Bayesian networks, big data, chatbox, clustering, cognitive computing, computing vision, convolutional neural networks known as CNN, data mining, data science, deep learning, decision trees, expert systems, genetic algorithms, heuristics, image recognition, machine learning, natural landscape processing, neural networks, object recognition, pattern recognition, predictive analytics, quantum computing, reinforcement learning, robotics, self-organized maps, support vectors, swarm intelligence, TensorFlow, unsupervised learning, virtual agents, voice recognition, adversarial learning, autoencoder, Bayesian optimism, cloud computing, data augmentation, dropout and ensemble learning, evolutionary algorithms, federated learning, GANs. There's more. And those are all whoops, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to do that. Whoop. There are many more of those, and those are terms that are used all the time in this. Yeah, I'll let you do that. But there's some cautionary terms that I'd like to just begin to outline, and I'm sure we're going to hear more of them today. Deep fake, blue media, red media, deep mind, indirect normality, provenance, canons, reverse porn, alignment, interoperability research, convergent goals, discriminator, good hearts law, art world, art schools, artists, geeks, Luddites, Slack data, ethereal source compiler, thinking brush, emitter, artist emitter, machinescaping, bias source, capitalism, commodity, anagrams and terms. So lastly, since we did a little research, there have been something like 1,700,000 articles written about AI since late 2021. That's how prevalent it is. So now I'd like to introduce Adam Bell, who along with his colleague Natasha Chuk put this all together. Adam did so much of the nuts and bolts every day putting the stuff up. It's a remarkable enterprise. Thank you for your patience. We're all excited to go forward.
Good morning. Thank you, Charles, for that kind introduction and welcome. And thank you all for joining us here today in person and via our live stream. Before I introduce today's keynote speaker, I just want to say a few brief words of thanks and review the day. We've got a packed schedule, and so I'm going to try and be brief. Following our keynote speaker, we will have a session on AI and the arts education. After a lunch break, we'll resume with 2 sessions, one on the ethical, legal, and social implications of AI, and another on the creative applications of AI. We've consolidated the Q&A sessions at the end of each session. So if possible, we ask that you come to the aisle and use the mic. The moderators will also repeat any questions that you have if you can't reach a mic from your seating area. We have a full day and limited time for questions, but we're going to do our best to make sure that we're encourage debate, discussion, because I'm sure there's going to be a lot that come up today. The program, which hopefully you guys grabbed in the lobby, has a QR code inside that will take you to an event page that has the presenter bios, the schedule, and additional readings. To save time, we're going to forego lengthy introductions for all of our distinguished speakers, and instead they'll be reintroduced to you by the moderators. First, I want to thank Charles for initiating this event and helping make it a reality, and Natasha Chuk, my co-organizer, for conceiving the framework for today's symposium and bringing much needed criticality and rigor to the structure of today's sessions. Special thanks to the rest of the MFA Photo, Video, and Related Media Department, Aaron Davis, Alice Lee, and Randy West for all their help putting this together, and for all the students helping today. I also want to thank SVA President David Rhodes, our sponsor, the Visual Arts Foundation, the Office of Academic Affairs, including the Provost, Chris Cyphers, and Michael Severance, the Operation Manager, for all their support and assistance in making this event a reality, and to the staff of the SVA Theater who are helping today. I also want to thank Adorama, who is one of our sponsors, and for their generous support. Lastly, I just want to thank David Ross, the chair of MFA Art Practice, for putting me in touch with today's keynote speaker, Hito Steyerl. Hito Steyerl modestly lists her bio as being, quote, a filmmaker and writer who lives in Berlin. For those of us familiar with her work and writing know she is much, much more. Her films, installations, essays, and lectures provocatively explore the evolving nature of images in contemporary life and the ways that they are shaped and distorted by capitalist systems of control and surveillance. Her work is often humorous, but is deeply revealing and pointed, speaking to our contemporary moment. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that she's one of the most influential and widely respected artists today, not only for her creative and theoretical work, but also for her outspoken political views and integrity, such as her recent refusal to accept the Hugo Ball Prize or her withdrawal from the 2022 Documenta, both due to the respective institutions' inability to address ongoing and historic anti-Semitism. Steyerl's work has been widely exhibited in solo and group exhibitions internationally, including her most recent 2020 survey, I Will Survive, presented by the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam in collaboration with the Pompidou in Paris. She's also the author of several highly acclaimed collections of essays, including The Wretched of the Screen and Duty-Free Art, Art in the Age of Planetary War. She is currently the professor of experimental film and video at the UDK, University of the Arts in Berlin. In an interview published by MoMA, Steyerl was asked, quote, "What does it mean to be an artist today?" Rejecting the market-driven pretense of the art world, she speculated that perhaps art should, quote, "look, listen, and interpret with precision, imagine without compromise or fear." Today, as we address the topic of AI and the lens-based images and all the questions and anxiety that that relationship provokes, this astute advice should remain foremost in our minds. It is my great honor to introduce Hito Steyerl.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here at this early time of the day, and thank you so much for the very generous introduction and invitation. I have to apologize because actually I haven't been automated enough. I'm still recovering from a very heavy flu, so I'm going to be somewhat diminished already. If you need machine learning, it's not yet there. I would have loved to present some shiny avatar of mine delivering this talk, on my behalf instead. But I think we have to wait some years. And then it's going to be really, really expensive. Okay. So my talk is called Mean Images. And I wanted to think through, all these new renderings by the new prompt-based generators such as DALL-E, Midjourney, Stable Diffusion, you name it, you've all played around with them, you know what I mean. But why am I calling them mean images? I was very inspired by a quote by novelist Ted Chiang. A while ago, he described the text output of ChatGPT, I think it was in a text in the New Yorker, he described it as a blurry JPEG of all the text in the web. So basically he described this text output as something like a semantic poor image. I thought, okay, yes, this output is sort of compressed, it's diminished, it's, a bit, it's poor basically, but there is also another quality to it, which I think is really decisive, namely that it is all these renderings are made out of the averaged booty from the internet. So basically what happens is that millions of pictures are scraped from the internet, and then they are sort of averaged into some mean or median. And this is basically driving the output of most of these generators. So mean in the sense of median or statistics. And I think this is a really important background for many of these images, and I will come back to this later. But on the other hand, this English term mean also has a lot of different meanings, meanings being one of them, all of which apply. Mean refers to sort of shabby or minor origins to something that is also the norm and also equally to something which is nasty. And I will also come back to this point later. It relates to meaning, but it also has something in common with the term commons and also with the term means in financial or instrumental terms. So the term mean is in itself some kind of composite, that bakes together somewhat incompatible meanings within one framework. But they are also far from being sort of random hallucinations, because they do pick up on latent social patterns that encode conflicting significations as sort of vector coordinates, and they visualize real existing social attitudes. And this is also why I think they are quite interesting. They are social dreams without sleep that process society's somewhat irrational functions to their logical conclusions. And also they rely on vast infrastructures that are basically creating huge amounts of pollution, of carbon emissions, and they also create disenfranchised labor that exploits political conflict as a resource. So this was the too long to read version. Now I would be happy to go home, but I'm going to go into detail with all of these. Okay, what is this? This is a very interesting glitch that emerged last autumn when people started using application which is called Dream Fusion. And what is Dream Fusion doing? It's basically transforming text prompts into 3D models or point clouds. And people started noticing if you generate 3D models through these applications, then they will start showing many heads, right? They will have heads all over the place pointing in all kinds of different directions. And they called this, the Twitter users, the Janus problem, or the Janus head problem. What is Janus? It's this Roman god, obviously, who is known for being portrayed having several heads looking into different directions, one into the past, one into the future, but it is also the god of war and peace, the god that stands in to signify a moment of break or of transition. And so, but I think that this Janus head problem also touches on a very interesting issue, because you have basically several individuals being portrayed as one entity. So it also points to the problem of the relation between the individual and the many, or the one and the crowd, or the group and the individual, the class, etc., etc., etc. What is the relation, for example, between private and common interests? It's also something which one could see baked into this kind of representation. This is a very interesting tool, which probably most of you know already. It's a web tool, a search engine called Have I Been Trained, developed by Matt Dryhurst and Holly Herndon. And you are able, through this search engine, to check whether your own images have been used to train machine learning models, in this case a model called Stable Diffusion, which was trained on a huge scale data set called the Lion 5B for 5 billion text image pairs. And through using this tool, you can check if your own images have been used to train this model or not. And I entered my name, and sure enough, this is what I came up. Not surprising, I guess, if you enter your own names, you will all show up in that database as well. What do diffusion models do? As you all know, they render, some rendering upon giving a prompt input by first adding and then subtracting some noise. So I was curious to see how would the model deal with this kind of input, with this kind of training data? And I entered a very, very simple prompt. It was just an image of Hito Steyerl. And this is what I got, which is not the most flattering before-after juxtaposition for sure. I cannot really recommend this treatment. Maybe one could call it an mandatory artificially intelligent hair loss device. So this thing looks rather mean, or maybe even demeaning, but I think that this is precisely the point, because the question is not, is it mean or not? Yes, it is, but what kind of mean is it? Whose mean is it? Which one? And stable diffusion renders a number, any number of portraits of mine in this kind of state of frozen age rage. And you don't really exactly know how it gets from the training data to this output. But on the other hand, usually people would blame it on some kind of black box algorithm where secret operations take place. This is not the case with stable diffusion. We know the code, it's out in the open, so this is not a black box algorithm. What this actually is a white box algorithm, which means that I have been white boxed. It is a social filter, if you like. It is an approximate of how society, through a filter of averaged internet garbage, sees me. All it takes is to sort of remove the noise of reality from my photos and just extract the social signal instead, and this is what you get. But I'm not complaining, because actually I think it's fair enough. I have my own internal model of what stable diffusion actually looks like. So if you prompt me to tell you, what does stable diffusion look like? It looks like this. This is the one and only true portrait of diffusion models, and I'm running this kind of revenge algorithm operation in my own head. So the question is, what happened on the way from these more traditional photographs to what I call statistical renderings? What happened? And I think that these statistical renderings shift the focus of representation from establishing fact to expressing probabilities. They are data visualizations that do not really require any longer sort of indexical reference that photographs used to have, but they basically render probabilities. And what they do is they represent the norm by signaling the mean, and they represent likenesses with likelinesses. Let me give you one example. That's a very strange paper from something which is called the Racial Faces in the Wild database. What is this supposed to be? And my own face, again, is entangled with one of these rendergos, racial rendergos on the right-hand side. Where does this come from? In 2016, my name popped up in this list, and this is a list of people who were part of something, and this is 2016, right? So this is the Stone Age of machine learning. This is the Paleolithic. This is like, I don't know, 100,000 years ago. Anyway, this was a database, still is a database called Microsoft Celeb, and it contained the names and photos of 100,000 people who somehow happened to be on the internet, and all of these people were parts of this database. And this is information which was released and generated by Adam Harvey and Jules Laplace in the scope of their project Megapixels, where they looked into a lot of these large-scale databases. And you can see basically all the people that were contained in there. And I tell you, I would be so unhappy if I wasn't on that list, you know. I think it's a real honor to be part of these people. But what was this list actually used for? If your name was mentioned on the list, then Microsoft would encourage researchers to download photos of your face to build a biometric profiles of yours. And I had become part, obviously, of an early training data set for more inclusive facial recognition algorithms. And sure enough, other researchers used it, among them the racial faces in the wild guys, who had the specific goal to make facial recognition more diverse and racially inclusive by these kind of algorithms being able to recognize people other than white people. And they came up with this contraption which was able to sort of segregate 4 different types, racial phenotypes from one another, which is what these render ghosts are about on the right-hand side. And it's no coincidence that they recall these early statistical photographic composites from the 19th century made by Francis Galton, who was the founder of statistics on the one hand, but also eugenics on the other hand. And he came up with a photographic method to visualize what he called certain types. This is the so-called Jewish type. He also had types referring to certain illnesses, but also to criminality. And the interesting thing is that he tried to visualize all these types, essentially to get rid of them, right? Because they were supposed to be overcome or eliminated by attempts of what they called plant breeding, racial improvement, and so on and so on. So the science of statistics in its early days is very much entwined with eugenicism. And the render ghosts turned out to be actual mugshots. And this background has been explored quite a lot by people like Wendy Chan, for example, Lila Lee Morrison. They went a lot into, figuring out this background. But this is not exactly where statistics is today, because over the course of the 20th century, there were, of course, many, many improvements, refinements, fine-tuning being made. As Jordan Joke explained in his book Revolutionary Mathematics, this was more or less by integrating a lot of tools which were basically based on market imaginaries, including parameters such as costs and affordances and contracts into calculation. And in his words, this integrated the mathematics of a well-calibrated casino into statistical science, which means that the calculation of probability was optimized for profitability. And the interesting thing now with the statistical renderings is that they enhance this operation with a quasi-magical effect, because what seems to happen with all the prompt generator renderings is somehow magically categories start emerging out from the data. And this is a real difference, to how data used to be visualized before, because, there were graphs and diagrams and clusters and whatnot, but now data are being visualized in the exact shape of the thing they are supposed to represent. So, for example, you would be visualizing a weather report through the image of a cloud. And thus you have this impression of immediacy, of the lack of any kind of mediation or alienation. Sort of the statistical reality itself seems to sort of emanate from these renderings. And Galton did this for faces somehow, but the interesting thing with the prompt renderings is that they not only do it for persons or people, but also for objects, for actions, basically for the whole of reality. In a way, these operations are racializing reality. They tend to emulate, neural networks tend to emulate a market logic in which reality is permanently at auction. And if we go back to these sort of strange elephants and squirrels, then we can see how this really works out. Because you remember the very basic example to explain statistics to anyone is the example of the coin, which is thrown up in the air, and then it somehow comes back with a probability of 50% of being either heads or tails if the coin is not rigged and if the experiment is even and fair. And here we can see that somehow there is a very interesting model of probability going on in here, because with these animals, you know, if we throw them, so to speak, up in the air, they will come down heads and heads, not heads and tails. The probability for them coming down tails is very much diminished, right? So we have to conclude that there is a sort of fork of probability theory going on within these models, which we could describe as the head and head solution. And how does this work out with the examples I just mentioned, with those? Because the goal of these operations was to make, you know, facial recognition more diverse and inclusive, and thus reducing bias. But these examples end up basically, in order to reduce bias, fine-tuning bias, you know, and improving basically racial discrimination. And that's an interesting head and head solution. So one of the consequences of this data set was that a company called SenseTime used these kinds of materials. It is a computer vision surveillance company that provided surveillance to Chinese authorities to monitor and track Uyghur minority members. Has been flagged numerous times for human rights violations, etc. So it seems that the combination of my own name and face was not only used to optimize machine vision for racial classification, but that this was put into practical application by a real existing autocracy to sort of identify and surveil members of ethnic minorities. And as I said, this is an example from the Stone Age, right, of facial recognition, machine learning, etc., etc. But now all your faces and names have been used for similar operations. There is no doubts about that. So this is one of the reasons why, you know, the idea of reducing bias within large-scale data sets and machine learning models, etc., only superficially solves problems, because it limits changes to parts of the output to make it sort of more palatable on a cosmetic level for Western audiences, but it also leaves the structures of the industry and its modes of production intact. And what do I mean with that? Because, I mean, who is doing the labor, basically? That's the question. Who is owning the means of production in this kind of mean production? And if we go back to this example of trying to eliminate bias, then this is quite simple. Reducing bias is mainly done by training so-called filters, which are then basically responsible for getting rid of harmful, illegal, biased, offensive, etc., material. So how is this being done? You need a lot of people, basically humans, who are subjected to exactly the same thing which you do not want to see, and they have to identify and tag it. There have been a lot of examples out in the public recently of the so-called ghost workers or micro workers, which very often are based in the so-called global south, who are tasked with this kind of labor. Venezuela, for example, is a very important hub for this kind of micro work, but also places like Iraq and Palestine are quite important hubs of micro labor, where people are basically tasked to tag and identify the material which other people are not supposed to see. And interestingly enough, this does not only happen in the global south. I was part of a group effort with a German weekly called Die Zeit recently, where some of my colleagues did some research and found out that also in Germany there is a huge population of people who are barred from, so to speak, legal labor because they are refugees or waiting for refugee status, etc., who are doing this kind of labor. So this is one example from one person who was doing this kind of job in Germany, who is describing how he had basically to identify pictures of cuts and try to decide whether these were suicide attempts or not, and then he had to go to therapy, like all of his colleagues, all of which were very, very educated. All of them had master's degrees, were scientists and so on, and they were supposed to sit at the desks for 10-hour shifts to basically tag and identify violent pictures. Another interesting testimony also, it's so recent I haven't even managed to translate it, is that there is a large contingent, of course, of Syrian refugees in Germany who are also doing this labor, who during the recent earthquake in Turkey and Syria suddenly saw pictures, of their home regions, of their hometowns, even of their own houses being destroyed, and they were supposed to basically tag these images so they would not possibly, traumatize everyone else. So that's the kind of, in a way, global labor situation that is also created precisely by the fact of trying to reduce or eliminate harm or bias. There is a reality being created of a sort of global class society in which political conflict and displacement and also war basically produces the kind of disenfranchised people who would be willing to take on this kind of jobs. And that's one of the consequences of what I could call, in this case, the mean production, the mean modes of production in this field. There's also some more absurdish consequence, which is that there are many machine learning applications which just pretend to be artificially intelligent or even based on any kind of computation, because what happens if you put any kind of query, there will actually be a human at the end of the line, which masquerades as an artificial intelligence, but which basically answer the questions themselves. These are quotes from a researcher who interviewed people in France. One student who was tasked to do this kind of labor was basically impersonating an AI to give recommendations for luxury travel to people who wanted to have this kind of information. And this leads to what Astra Taylor calls so-called photomation. It's not automation, but people pretending to be AIs. So the interesting thing is that maybe these labor conditions also bring me back to a more general observation, namely, what is the relation of statistics and reality, and what are these renderings showing us actually? Is maybe not reality, but something related. And many people, including myself, we have interpreted this shift from a science which is based on causality towards one which is based on probability and correlation as a sort of slide into magic and alchemy. But I think that this slide also captures a real existing aspect of reality, namely the fact that reality in itself is sometimes more structured like a casino than any sort of logical, construction. I read this blog post by a young person who was explaining why they were playing video games in times of depression. So whenever they would feel they were getting depressed, they would start playing certain video games because there was, a sense of calculable reward in there. So if you would basically plant a crop in a video game and irrigate it and, take care of it, then at the end of the day you would have a crop. Or if you would want to build a house or something and just keep building it, and it takes a long time, but at the end of the day you have a house. And this person said, this is not what it works like in reality. There is no logical correlation between input and output. The effort does not correspond at all to the result. So the causality is broken, but not, this is reality, it is broken in. There is a whole section of labor, both in the very precarious end, but also on the high end, in which basically correlation is the norm. You don't know. I mean, it's a kind of lottery. And in these cases, it's also way more rational to basically buy a lottery ticket than to expect any wage from the labor you're performing, because this is no longer the paradigm that reality operates in. And this is something which, in a way, those statistical renderings pick up on, right? They portray a world in which causality and logic has receded to certain, sectors, and where basically chance and random operations and pure luck are the norm. And this is also how a writer called Phil Jones describes, the reality of micro work. He says, workers operate increasingly in a quasi-magical economy of gambling and lottery. And he has this memorable term that wage transforms into a wager. So basically, it transitions into the realm of pure chance and contingency. All these things, in my view, make one thing very clear, which is that, we talk about training a lot when we talk about machine learning, about models, data sets, blah, 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 and so on. And it always seems as if, something on the side of the machine is being trained. But I think that actually the main thing that's being trained is not the machine or models or anything, it's ourselves. So it's us as users that are being trained. And this makes also one thing quite clear. What are we being trained to do? And this is quite interesting. They train basically the people who use these kind of applications, they train them to get used to new production pipelines, to new software stacks which integrate all these machine learning applications, etc. We are being trained to get used to a production environment in which we have to pay constantly rent to some corporation or another to even, not only do our work, but even be able to access our own work. Adobe Cloud, I don't know how many people are still stuck in there, is a real, example of how you have to pay rent every month to a corporation to even be able to open your own files, right? And that is supposed to be the norm, that you are getting trained to to get used to this kind of environments in which large-scale corporations like, for example, Microsoft, provide the whole pipeline, from the cloud service, Azure in the case of Microsoft, via the softwares, over the hardwares, etc., down to the last piece of input. And in order to use this monopoly environment, and Microsoft have announced, I think 2 days ago, that they were going to implement GPT-4-based services into their Office suite, etc. So this is what we are being trained to do, to accept these kinds of monopoly pipelines as a sort of new normality, and to get used, to have to pay rent to them every month. And so basically what people are being trained is to accept this infrastructure, which is a massive top-down cloud infrastructure based on this kind of cheap click labor performed by people in conflict regions, etc. And also, this is something I have written a whole other text upon. There is, of course, tremendous environmental impact also that is tied to this kind of massive cloud operation environments. So there's a lot of carbon emissions, etc., energy dependencies. I can't really go into that, but that's also a very important aspect of that. So if we go back to this Janus head problem, then one would start to have to think about also to untrain oneself from this system of multiple extortion and extraction, which would mean to activate, so to speak, the other perspective of the whole Janus system, which indicates transition, as I said in the beginning. It indicates transition from one system into another. And why should one not try to decide to transition away from this perspective, which looks onto a past made of stolen data? Because as we all know, and I've hinted at it many times already, that most of the data that are used for these kinds of operation are basically hijacked. They are basically kidnapped from the web through big scraping operations. And so basically these whole operations rest on a lot of unpaid labor, which is appropriated and privatized in some kind of primordial accumulation kind of move. And this is also what generates a lot of the recent backlashes against so-called AI art. There's many artists who have said, oh my God, my work was stolen, my style was appropriated, I'm not getting paid for it, we have to stop it. And this is completely understandable that this would be the gut reaction against this kind of appropriation, structural appropriation attempt that's going on in this activity of training data for all these models. It would be to demand individual recompensation or to implement opt-in, opt-out buttons from these training activities which already have been implemented. Well, I think maybe that's a good first step, very good first step, but maybe not enough, because there's also an argument to be made for data to be in the public domain, right? Not protected by individual copyright. If we think, for example, of photographs of looted archaeological artifacts, from Mesopotamia or anywhere, the copyright usually resides with the same museums that have stolen them. So should we have to respect this kind of copyright? Shouldn't these data really rather have to be in some kind of public domain? What is the line? What is the balance between these two aspects? And one very simple, or not simple, but obvious solution would be to start basically recognizing that there is a commons within the mean, so to speak, because the commons, or some kind of former commons, forms the hidden base of any stolen data set. And one possible step to sort of start articulating or even solving this problem would be to redefine both of these scraped data collection, but also all the models trained on them as something which are in fact data commons. What is a data commons? It's basically a collection of data which is organized and administrated by, common owners of these database. This is a definition from a book called Platform Socialism about what data commons are. And those data commons would also need to include provisions that, usage of any kind of these models would need to be recompensated not only on an individual base, but also on a communal base. And that such compilations would be, so to speak, a jointly managed resource. And this could be, so to speak, a first step to recover the commons from within the means, the mean modes of production in which they are administrated right now. And I was just imagining, for every prompt render that people generate now, and there's a lot of them. I think it costs like $100,000 a day just to answer all the queries of DAL-E. So if a fraction of a cent, for every one of these queries would go into this kind of peer-to-peer system of a communal database, then one could think about peer-to-peer art funding or other sorts of attempts to benefit a common art ecosystem in a completely different way. So basically, there are two options in the Janus head model. The one is to remain stuck within a monopolist idea of a future in which there are proprietary pipelines, expropriated data, and massive global inequality for click workers. But the upside of this is that you get, free renderings of fluffy robots on horsebacks. On the other hand, or on the other head, rather, you could also opt for a period of resilient small tech with minimum viable configurations powered by renewable energies, which does not require theft and extraction, exploitation, energy waste, and overall mean modes of production. And one could also try to untrain oneself from all these bullshit beliefs about the inevitability of technological progress, about nicely aligned AGIs and automated performance art by deliberately unhinged chatbots. And why should you really want to opt for this solution? Because the best thing about it is that you will not be required to lose your hair. Thank you.
I can crawl, it's fine. I can make some exercise, it's all right. Hito, thank you so much for your, I'm here, it's dark and I'm crawling to make some exercise and not so digital machine learning exercise. But thank you so much for the talk and for all your work. But you mentioned Janus and you talk about these two phases, and one of the very famous prayers for Janus is to keep track of time, to keep time in motion and keep time secure. And in the same way that you talk about this joinment and all these images coming together or being molded together. It's almost as all these times are coming together and being joined together in some way. So if you could comment upon this very complicated constellation between what is at the same time what can be seen as the end of causality and end of this out of jointment of time, with this almost miraculous fusion of time in a context where, you know, it almost seems as magic, but it's been used for profit and for everything that causality built in place.
Maybe I'll just use this in the meantime. Thanks a lot for the question. Okay. Yeah, well, I mean, you gave the answer already. Thanks for that. Maybe I can expand just a little on that. Of course, anything that's being trained is trained on past data, which means that we have a preponderance of past in all these data. And the interesting thing is that now it will require a huge effort to keep these things updated, the models. So for example, if you want to integrate something like GPT-4 into search, it means that the model has to be retrained constantly in a real-time way, which means that, you know, it will require a huge amount of energy also just to keep the database to the point in time of yesterday, right? And so basically this updating will be one of the very interesting problems happening. And I'm sure it can be solved somehow, but on the other hand, why? That's really the question. I mean, why does anyone need to make all this effort and basically waste of energy in order to serve me up with the address of a fictional restaurant if I want to go out and eat somewhere, you know? I mean, you really ask yourself, what's the point? What are we updating to, actually? What is it? What's the benefit?
Hello. Hi. So the question that was forming while you were talking was, is there a better way, I guess, when you're talking about sort of the physics of all of these things that are exploitative and et cetera? So then you kind of answered it, which was this more democratically organized, participatory AI model. And my question now is, I hear that sort of solution offered with things like Web3 as an example, without going off the rails. But of course, then with Web3, there's all of these issues and further physics of that. But the promise there is you will be liberated from Web2, and you will have more control, et cetera. So you're sort of offering a similar idea with this democratic data set, which I think is a great idea. But do you foresee problems with that? And as a follow-up, is there something that I can do today to sort of move towards a democratically participatory AI model?
Okay, thanks a lot. That's a really great question. Yeah, I mean, this is something that also occurred to me, that basically these prompt renderings or statistical renderings in this year are the equivalent of NFTs in 2021. First, by the amount of, well, excitement or hysteria they generate, but also because both are onboarding tools into technological environments. So basically NFTs were things that taught people about, you know, crypto mechanics, about wallets, about exchanges, etc., etc. And similarly, the prompt renderings are teaching people about, you know, the whole terminology of machine learning and how to use these things and how to get used for them, to them, etc., etc. And also, it seems to me pretty remarkable how very quickly one Web3, which was based on crypto, has been sort of replaced with a Web3 that is based on machine learning applications such as GPT 3, 4, whatever. So there has been this very, very quick turnover where one, you know, stale promise is immediately replaced with tomorrow's stale promise, so to speak. Yes, but both point to a problem which is completely irresolved and which I think is at the heart of all of them, is the idea to automate basically the question of how do people live together. How do they share resources? How do they make up their minds? How do they make decisions? And both are attempts to sort of automate this problem and to come up with basically, automated solutions to them, technological solutions. But this question cannot be automated because it's fundamentally about how humans, deal with one another. This is nothing a machine can really do on their behalf because it's just so tricky and so awful and such an intractable problem, right? How to, even share the smallest common property, let alone the state, the welfare system, or whatever, no? So basically, this is the irresolved question, and this is why it keeps coming up back again, and it's being processed, so to speak, and given new technological disguisements. But the question as such doesn't change, and the fact that it won't be solved by technology doesn't change either.
Just go down to the mic, yeah. Just come down to the mics. So I think we have time for maybe 2 more questions, including this one. So, go ahead.
This is on.
No, you can pick it up.
Oh. Hello. I just have a quick question. Having found yourself on a variety of these engines and lists that you kind of showed us today, is there anything that you're doing on an individual level to increase your privacy or your security that maybe we could imply?
It's too late. Too late for that.
Is it even a
I
concern of
haven't
yours?
been on social media for many years. That could help, but also it's too late for that. So, yeah. Maybe already think now about the next problem and try to solve that. That's gone. Yeah.
Hi, thanks for the great talk. I'm wondering if there's anything for the AI research community that can do right now to help elevate some of these societal challenges that we're seeing.
You mean is AI going to help society?
No, the research part, like
The research, yes, of course.
Do?
Absolutely. The AI discourse or machine learning discourse is so much steeped into stereotypes and mythology, mainly mythology. It's all about this old Frankenstein story, the robots that are going to take over, etc., etc. And just to debunk that and make it more technical and actually material and real, I think that's really, really important, right? To try to show the things that are really happening while people are talking about the robot apocalypse. I just was on the West Coast a few weeks ago, and it was so, also because I haven't been there since the pandemic, I was so surprised to see so many of the downtowns there empty and, disrupted in a very, very real sense of the word. So this is basically what's happening as a real-world consequence of technological disruption on a lot of different layers, that basically the physical, material, environment, urban fabric of many people is changing as we speak, right? And I think it's way more interesting to focus on these real-world effects, than to sort of keep talking about. There is a novelty about what's happening. That's undeniable. There is a sort of almost, there's a very, very distinct shift happening nowadays. But it would be very important to spell it out, its real consequences, and not, the mythological ramifications of it.
more question? Anyone have one
There
last
is a
question?
gentleman over there.
Oh, hi. Thank you for the great symposium. And I just wonder, I just went to the Museum of Modern Art like last week, and so the Inadol's unsupervised. And I think it's really good show, and I really like the visual like narrative, and it's really attractive. But but compared to your work to the Anadol's show, I think the his work is like the context is the empty. Like I couldn't like recognize any kind of the context from his work, but your work has some meaning, and the I think the meaning is more important for the most of the artworks. So I just wonder, like, how do you think about Anadol's work?
Sorry, that's too difficult. You have to ask my AGI version. You know, once I've been automated, just ask it. Just ask it this kind of really difficult question. I cannot comment on my colleagues' work. Really, that's not possible.
Hello. I feel like AI, there's a lot of pessimism going on. I was wondering if there's any, in 10 years we see like, oh, there can be a lot of bad things happening. Do you have a optimistic view in 10 years of how AI can actually help?
Well, I don't, but I mean, undeniably, there's a lot of things that, you know, machine learning can do. For example, it's very good at pattern recognition. It's very good at diagnosing, you know, certain, or let's say interpreting, for example, radiological findings, for example, right? Or solving a lot of computational tasks that were previously just too render intensive to solve. So there is some benefit, right, to machine learning in many ways. It's maybe just really not on the level of these unhinged chatbots, you know, that we are being, you know, fed for entertainment, basically.
Thank you.
I think that's all the time we have for questions. So I just want to thank Hito again for her brilliant and insightful talk. Thank you.